Hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to welcome you to this webinar on building and rebuilding joy in the third third of life. Before we hear from our featured guest, let me introduce myself and just say a little bit about our work. My name is Mark Roberts. I'm a senior strategist for the Max Pree Center for Leadership at Fuller Seminary. The Pree Center is committed to providing leaders in all walks of life with experiences that will help you grow in your sense of purpose, deal with issues that matter, and move toward greater fruitfulness in your life and work. The Pree Center focuses today, as we have for many years, on serving leaders in the marketplace, also in the church. Recently, though, we've realized that literally millions of leaders are entering a new season of life, sometimes called retirement, though we tend to think of it as the third third of life. And many in this season of life aren't just sitting back and watching others make the world a better place. They're investing their lives in ways that serve others and that help to transform our society. Everyone in the third third of life needs to have a vision, a new vision of what their life could be all about. And that's what we're doing in the Pree Center through our experiences and resources from folks like you'll be hearing from today. And if you're interested, you can learn more from our website, thepree.org. Look for the phrase third third in the nav bar at the top of the page. So today's webinar will last just about an hour, and I'll begin by interviewing our special guest. If you have questions that you'd like to ask, you can do so by putting them in the Q&A function of Zoom. Put them in the Q&A, not the chat, and I'll be checking the Q&A and we'll be asking questions as we get them there. So now I'm really pleased to introduce our featured expert for this webinar. Dr. Jim Wilder has been training leaders and counselors on 5 continents for over 27 years. He's the author of many books with a strong focus on maturing and relationship skills for leaders. His co-authored book, Living from the Heart Jesus Gave You, has sold over 100,000 copies. Jim has published many articles and has video training sets for leaders, a resource called Thrive. He's the founder and chief neurotheologian of Life Model Works, a nonprofit working at the intersection of brain science and theology, and they're building contagiously healthy Christian communities by equipping networks and leaders. And Dr. Wilder has done extensive work speaking. He's spoken at Fuller Seminary before, where he earned his PhD, and has just a really strong commitment to helping people in the third third of life discover how to live with joy. So, Dr. Jim Wilder, so glad you are with us today.
I'm grateful and glad to be with you, Dr. Roberts. It's good to be here at the Pree Center. So.
Thank you. So first of all, I've just said a little bit about you, and so folk will have some idea where you're coming from, but could you say a little more about your background and maybe even your current work?
Yes, well, my background was sort of trying to figure out how people change and things that go wrong along the way. I was thinking of going into medicine originally. And then I actually witnessed a miraculous healing of somebody from a post-traumatic stress disorder and changed my interest into religious studies and theology, went to Fuller, almost by surprise. But when I was there, I got assigned from some of my training to go to a community center that was started by Van Nuys First Baptist. And a lot of the Fuller professors volunteered there to do various kinds of community service. And so I got involved in helping churches and people change. And over the years, even at one point, we were working at out of the Fuller offices there in the Lee Travis building. And again, trying to integrate how does being a Christian match with how do we become the kind of people we want to be? And that's been fascinating for me across the whole life spectrum. You know, most of the talk at that point was about how to do that with children and families. But even as you grow older, do you stop changing just because you get older? And the answer, I think, is no. Even as elders, which is how we've named the last stage, we're continuing to become a transformed, a new kind of a person. So from glory to glory, I'd like to think.
I like that. Yeah, it is interesting. When I was younger, I think, my grandparents were just my grandparents. They were always the same, and I now believe they probably went through a lot of things. But well, that's so interesting. Now, in your bio, I've got to ask you about this. You describe yourself as a neurotheologian, and I actually Googled on that, looked up, and I realized there's a thing. But I expect some of our folk have not heard neurotheologian before. Do you want to explain a little bit what that is?
Yeah, well, I actually happened to have as my first supervisor and one of my first professors, Lee Travis, who had actually been involved in inventing the electroencephalograph, the brainwave machine and stuff like that. And I remember sitting sort of innocently in class, one of his classes, when he began to talk about neurotheology. He says the intersection of God and the brain. He said, how does God interact with the brain? And at that time, it was the reticular activating system was very popular as the source. But he was already developing that sort of thing and talking about this intersection. And I think he's the one that first gave me the thought that anything that is really true about human nature has got to be at the overlap of what Scripture says is true about us and what neuroscience says is true about how the human brain operates, because we have to live Christian life in a human brain. And the odd thing is, Jesus was the first person to really combine that well. And so figuring out how that works is what neurotheology is all about.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it makes sense that there's these two disciplines that often don't overlap, but you're kind of living in that overlap place, which is just is fascinating. And so, well, I'm pleased to know that your interest began at Fuller Seminary, although I know you've taken that a long way in your own research and study and writing. So our webinar topic is building and rebuilding joy in the third third of life. So let me start with just a really basic question. What is joy?
Well, it was sort of unknown to me, I might say. That's something I didn't actually learn at Fuller, but we didn't talk much about that. But at one point I was working again in Shepherd's House, which was this center in the valley, and we were seeing about 1,200 abuse victims a month in appointments and stuff like that. And some of them were getting better and some of them weren't. They're all getting the same care. And so we're trying to figure out, why is it that some people can really grasp a hold of these things and move forward? They sustain their gains, and other people didn't. And Dallas Willard's wife, Jane Willard, was one of our supervisors, one of my first supervisors there. And so we were working with Dallas Willard's spiritual disciplines and developments. And again, some people could grab a hold of those and sustain gains, and for other people, they weren't working at all. So the mystery for us was, why for some people did it work and for others didn't? And I remember at one time praying and asking God to give me the answer for what was the difference between these people. First thing we noticed was that the ones that were sustaining gains had a community around them that in some level functioned like a family. Now, most of them are abuse victims, as you know, so they'd been messed up by their family, but they're actually recovering by virtue of another family that came together. We would only call it a spiritual family, because usually they connected in some spiritual way through church, but never directly because the church sponsored it. It just sort of happened in that context. And at that point, we came across the brain science of Alan Shore, and he said that how people actually develop and get resilience is this thing called joy. And it was so central to how the brain develops, and it was relational joy. He said joy is that sparkle in somebody's eye when they look at you. It's that sense that you're delighted in. It's like, I'm really glad to be with you right now. So that's what babies need. That's what you need across your entire lifespan to continue growing into the person you're going to be. And at that point, I asked myself, But if it's that important to the brain, why isn't it in the Bible? And then I went back and reread the Bible, and all of a sudden I'm seeing all these references to joy and joyfulness. I've been raised in a kind of Christianity where joy is sort of like the maraschino cherry on top of
Yeah.
if everything goes right, you get this little extra bonus. It wasn't essential, but it turns out that the human person develops in response to people who are glad to be with you. It's this relational connection that we now call attachment. So attachment joy, this hesed, this glad to be together. I believe that's also what the New Testament means by love. We're with people who are really glad to be with us. That is actually what creates all the good things in the brain, and I think is sort of fundamental for a spiritual life. But that was a much later discovery, actually, sort of looking back at scripture.
That's such an interesting definition of joy, because I've read many over the years, and they all make sense. But the thought of sort of what it is to be with somebody that you love being with, I mean, I think we can relate to that feeling, even and that's that we can feel that even in hard times, sometimes especially in hard times, right? You can be going through really difficult things, but you're with people that you love and they love you, and there is this sense of joy. I love that definition. I think that's so. What are some of the things that keep us from experiencing joy like that?
Well, really, it comes down to two things. One is we don't have any people, and there are folks who don't have any people. The widow, the stranger, the orphan, and so there are people who would love to be healed, but they have no one to put them into the pool when the water's agitated. It's the lonely people. They're going to be low joy. And if you think of every place in the world where there's you wouldn't want to live there, it's universal. They're all low joy environments. People are just not glad to be together for a whole variety of reasons. The other reason, though, which is probably more true for most of our listeners, is that we're afraid of our own feelings. So to be present and experience joy means we also have to feel the pains of life and the emotions that go with it. Most of us don't know how to use our emotions. Most of us can use sadness, for instance. If someone is sad, we know how to be glad to be with them. But if they're angry or ashamed or disgusted, we really don't know how to use those emotions usually, and so we're afraid we're going to feel shame or be rejected, and so we start protecting ourselves instead of actually being glad to be with people in their distress. The simple formula we find in Romans: you should rejoice with those that rejoice and weep with those that weep. If we do both of those things, we've got a very resistant to crumbling kind of joy. It's resilient, because neither the sorrow nor the good times. And frankly, I grew up in a family in a Christianity that tried to calm down the people that were rejoicing too much and cheer up the ones that wept. So we're trying to stay in that narrow zone, sort of which is hard.
Backwards. Yeah.
Boy,
you're describing my family. I especially the inability to really deal with negative emotions. My grandmother, who was maybe the most influential person in my experience growing up, in addition to my parents, she had a saying, and the saying was, make somebody happy and you'll be happy too. And so anytime there was any evidence of any unhappy emotion, anger, sadness, loss, anything, we were immediately reminded that we needed to cheer people up. That was the thing, go cheer them up. And it never really occurred to us, maybe just go listen to them and be with them in this place, which is, Anyway, so that's why people like me ended up going to people like you and spending lots of money and time to kind of work out a different way of being in the world. That's so important. But I'm also impressed, and Jim, of course, you know this, but the research on folk in the third of life, loneliness and isolation is a huge problem, especially for men as we get older. Women seem to have more of an ability to make connections. Men are often very isolated. So what you're describing as something that would keep us from being joyful is something that a lot of us struggle with in different seasons of life, but very much so as we age.
Well, one of the very closely related points in that, and it's often something that's reflected also in the midlife crisis kind of thing, is that men in particular, but more recently, women are being put on the same track. Your identity gets tied very closely to your performance, and performance in your brain goes into the simulator, the as if circuits. So I kind of become a person that I need to be to get the right results. Mm-hmm. And then when the demands to perform are removed, I'm left with who am I now? Because actually the relational connections, the joy connections are not really what we look at as the basis for performance in the West. I'm part of what we're talking about is we think from my organization's point of view that we need to put joy, being glad to be together, back into the work center, back into church, back into families. We really need to focus on how are we going to be glad to be together in the middle of this? And if we're developing those skills, they transfer very nicely into the third, because there's a lot of people who could use somebody who's glad to be with them, who's a little farther down the road and can reflect to them some wisdom. But our culture doesn't actually identify that as an important part of either functioning at work or functioning in the later part of life. So if we don't know how to be together with people when they're unhappy, that is exactly what is going to stall our boat later on when we're trying to get through some rough seas.
Wow. I'm struck, Jim, that we have an opportunity right in this season of life, maybe to actually sense more of the joy that comes from being with people as we're beginning to get back with people, in emerging from the pandemic. I mean, I had a business lunch with somebody this week. I haven't had one of those in 15 months. And it was so fun to be able to sit at a table with a real human being. And whereas 15 months ago, I would have taken that for granted. So maybe we have a chance to savor those relationships and the joy a little bit. So
I think people have been reawakened to the importance and need of being able to be with other people and see somebody who's actually genuinely glad to be with us. The problem with the internet is that the being glad to be together runs back and forth between one person's nonverbal to another 6 times per second. And the internet runs too slow to actually engage that function. So there's this fatigue that sets in trying to see what is that person's reaction. And because there's just too much delay in the internet system for us to actually experience it, but face to face, when somebody's face or eyes light up to see us, our brains go, oh, there they are. That's the real thing. That's joy right there. It's again nonverbal, so we don't really put it. We don't consciously track that's what happened unless we really know what to look for.
That's a great opportunity. So the title of this webinar is Building and Rebuilding Joy in the Third of Life, and I guess I'd like to start with the build question. What can we do to build joy into our lives and into our lives in the third?
All right. Well, the first thing that I would say for most of us is that we come into whatever we do relationally with some some handicaps, let's say, some less than perfectly trained relational skills. Most men, for instance, have discovered across their lifespan that the women in their lives are better at relationships than they are. And most women have come to the point of thinking it's a little hard to have a relationship with men, but from just cumulative experiences. So we have this sort of negative feeling about it. And so the first thing I have to say is, if you're feeling like this isn't what you're good at, we should enter it with some admitted weaknesses. Hey, I'm not good at this. I may not be good at golf, or I may not be good at whatever else I'm going to be doing, but the brain is for learning. And so I can learn this stuff. The second thing is to learn to be a little present, because if we're not present, we're not going to be joyful. So noticing how it feels in my body, and right, that intimidates a bunch of people, but there's this funny little thing that the right orbital prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain thinks of itself as me, is only part of your brain that actually can be aware of your body. So it isn't that our body matters that much, but if I'm aware that I'm here and what my body is feeling at the moment, it's a good test, saves you about $2,000 on a brain scan at that moment, to say, I'm here and I'm present, I'm noticing what's going on in my body. One way to do that is to drink your favorite coffee, or taste something you like, or notice the breeze. They're all parts of saying, here I am. And then the next thing is, simplest thing is, think of something we appreciate or are thankful for, and tell somebody about it. I've never found anybody get offended because they were appreciated. And so if we enter into that thankful or appreciative state, which, by the way, we enter the Lord's presence with thanksgiving in our heart, right? The Lord, his gates with praise. Part of being relational is just finding something to be thankful for. So when we're doing that, now we're in the state where we can be thankful. And by the way, your brain about 18 months of age sets a normal. Whatever it is that's been in your environment, that's what it expects to be normal. So if it was anxious, when you first wake up, your brain will try to get you anxious. When you last go to bed, your brain will try to think of everything to make you anxious to get you back to normal. Or if it was angry, your family was angry or lonely or whatever, it keeps dragging you back to that point. So one of the practices that Dallas Willard suggested, for instance, and it's good brain practice, is when you first wake up and before you go to bed, get into a thankful state, an appreciative state, and it starts to reset your brain's normal. And instead of fighting that all day long, we need to reinstate it. Now, you have mentioned about the last third of life. One of the things that happens, most of the things that we're grateful for are naturally relational. And so when we have losses, we lose a partner, we lose capacity. 2 weeks ago, my wife had a stroke and she's lost some of her capacity. We're trying to deal with that. Those losses, when we think of thankful things, tend to drag us immediately back into our sense of loss. And that's why we have to have some additional considerations later in life when we're starting to rebuild joy, because later third of life is also where the losses tend to build up as well. And so we need to build and rebuild.
So we got a question that it's perfect for this moment. So let me go ahead and ask this. And here it is. Is joy something we can develop, work on, choose, or is it primarily a gift of the Spirit, as found in Galatians 5, that's available to all believers? But can believers choose to be joyful or not, depending on how they deal with life's ups and downs?
Well, the answer from a brain perspective is no, it can't be chosen. That's something that developed primarily out of voluntarism, which was a philosophy that put choice in the will right at the top of human nature instead of a love and relationship. What we can choose are the things that build joy. remind us of joy. Most of us carry joy experiences with us, and the fruit of the Spirit of joy is by the practice of remembering that God is with us. But if we don't actually experience God being with us, the problem is our brain doesn't respond with joy. It's like, well, you say God's glad to be here, but with me, but when I look around, I can't find him. And you'll find those people tend to get depressed instead of joyful. So this relational or interactive experience of God is something that we actually have to learn to experience. That's what a lot of the spiritual disciplines, for instance, teach us to do, to tune our mind, to be aware of God's presence. And if we run away from our own hard feelings, then because we're running away from our own hard feelings, we won't notice that God's there with us. That's usually what we call trauma. I'm here alone. There's no one on my side. I feel lonely. And under those experiences, we really kind of need somebody else to be with us who can experience God, because we're kind of overwhelmed. And so to do this without a community around us isn't really going to work during the hardest of times. During the hardest of times, we really need other people to see us. I know that God is here. You can't see God right now, but you can experience my presence here. And again, somebody has to be glad to be with us during the hard times. So an example of that is a few years ago, we were going to go to the Netherlands, and I heard my wife suddenly call my name from upstairs, and there was something about the tone of her voice that made me drop everything and run to get up there. And she just called my name was all it was, and she had fallen and broken her leg. Was trying to get down a pair of shoes to take to the Netherlands. Well, she never did make it to the Netherlands and all that. But the look in her eye when I walked into the closet where she'd fallen was, I'm extremely glad to be with you. You're here. This thank you. But it was not a happy moment at all.
Yeah.
But it's during those times, by sharing other people's suffering, I'm really glad you're here. The thought is, this is such a bad time, I just wouldn't want you to be alone. That is a form of joy that will carry us through these times. And so we have to learn to share those with other people. And if we're used to being strong and in control, we're usually a little reluctant to let other people into those moments. But when we have the rejoicing with those who rejoice and the sharing the hard times both as joy, now we are starting to have a joy that we can rebuild, because sometimes the doorway to being glad to be with someone else goes through a painful moment, doesn't it?
Yes. In fact, now you messed me up, because I'm remembering times like that, and they're deeply moving times of deep loss, but together as with the people you love. I love that way of thinking about joy. So your answer then to the one who says, can we choose to be joyful? It's not immediate, like you can't just say, okay, you go be joyful now, but we can choose to build into our lives practices and disciplines that will help us experience joy in our relationship with God. You mentioned gratitude, in our relationship with others. So we're not just sitting around waiting for it, but we're not revving up joy in our head the way I think my grandmother thought we should. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's exactly how I would describe it. Yeah. We are entering into the experiences that allow joy to happen. And we can, and I really recommend this, we can make a list of these experiences so that when we don't have joy, we can't choose joy, but we can remember the times that we did. We can even do that with people who have passed away. So I can remember times with my parents and grandparents that were joyful, and a good deal of other people who passed away. And so I can, after I've worked through enough of the painful grief loss, I can stay connected with them, and the things that really mattered to them, those memories bring me joy. So we can actually find the joy that we've stored, sort of like squirrels looking for the nuts they buried. But I keep a list. And furthermore, if you were to see my computer screen, every few minutes, a new picture that reminds me of a joyful event pops up on my screen. So I'm constantly through the day bathed by joy memories that build my resilience.
That's great. Love that. Hey, you're going to love this question. I got another one for you. Jim, this is your old buddy, Randy Sanders. So you know who that is. Please talk about, and this, you're just talking about this, about maintaining joy in the midst of losses. You mentioned losses. Seems to me like I'm losing about 2 people per week I've known in some capacity.
Yeah, there's the problem with trying to talk about this is that speaking always makes kind of a foolish portrayal of what's actually going on. That's so much deeper than words do anything for us. But the losses and sadness really bring us close to the question of who are the people that would want to share this sadness with us. And I would say, the scripture that says how precious to God are the loss of any of the saints. If no one else comes to mind, we have Jesus who weeps at the tomb of his friends, to say we have people who want to be with us during this time of sadness. And joy of the Lord is your strength follows the verse that says, and so they comforted the people and said, don't weep, because God is with you. That's the presence of God is our strength in the middle of this. If we've built communities that are willing to do that with us, we can remember if so-and-so were here, if they hadn't passed away, they would share this moment with me. And we try to build that into the existing moment. So who does God still have in my life who would share this time, would not want me to be alone? So again, going back to that phrase, who do I know that would say, well, this is such a hard time, I wouldn't want you to be alone in it. And it's often the person who's passed away. And it's a way of holding on to that, the attachment, which, these things are eternal things. Attachments don't just disappear because people die. Part of the reason that most older people are actually looking forward in some sense to being done with life and death is that they plan to be with people that they have lasting attachments with. So by building the things that we think and know are going to outlast life, we can actually, in a sense, be comforted by some of the very same things that bring us grief. It's really hard to put into words. So I just, when you articulate it, I thought that sounded like the dumbest thing anyone just said there with listening to myself. But I know I'm trying to express something that goes a good deal deeper than words can do justice to.
Well, we're getting some good questions, but here's one that kind of might help unpack some of that. And it's this: if moments of closeness to others only occur during painful or deep loss, that seems counter to the sense of joy. Who wants to sign up for being needed in someone's pain in the effort to find joy?
Well, we first of all have to say that from a brain perspective, and even spiritual things, if we can't perceive them with our brain, don't mean much, do they? So from a brain perspective, joy is a high energy state. It's amplified. So if I look at something I like, let's say my guitar, it doesn't give me joy per se, it makes me happy. But nothing amplifies as I look at the guitar, it just stays static. If I look into someone's eyes, then their joy amplifies with mine, and in a brain state that's doing this, in 6 to 10 seconds, I will go from a tiny little smile to a biggest smile as I happen to have. So when I was coming back from my father-in-law's funeral, for instance, flying in the plane, there was about 18-month-old baby 2 seats ahead that kept looking over the top of the seat. Pick up over the seat and there you are, and would smile. And I was actually exercising the part of joy that we really like, the smile with people. And one of the nice things is with being in the third of life, that if you've grown a relatively healthy personality, let's say, you are actually a licensed at-large joy agent. You're allowed to smile at anybody, any place. You can smile at the handsome young men, you can smile at the cute young girls, you can smile at the babies, you can smile at everybody else. You're actually, released into culture. Now, at a younger age, you couldn't go around smiling at everybody, but you reach a certain age, and there are, of course, the people that ruin that for all the rest of us. But this energy building joy state, you're going to have to put in, and you can do it in buses. I actually do it driving down the road. I look into there's a car, there's a little child in there. They're usually the best joy amplifiers. And I just smile at all the people there. I smile at grumpy drivers and watch them look like, why is he happy with me? But this building the positive side of joy, the part we all like, can be a very active ingredient of the third of life. And we need to engage that, as well as being willing to go through the darker side or the heavier side of joy as well. Both have to be exercised, or we'll soon get tired.
Well, that's helpful. So you're not saying the only way to experience joy is to be with people in your pain. You're saying that is an important and really essential part of a fullness of joy in our lives.
Yeah, what I'm saying basically this: that if we get blocked, it's usually because we don't want to go into one of those painful spots. Yeah, and that usually, it shuts down the growth and development of joy, because now we're avoiding how it might be painful. Yeah. But if all we do is go into the painful parts of life, we'll soon be drained and unhappy. So we have to build the positive sides of it as well, and quite look for those opportunities, and we can do that quite deliberately and willfully. So again, using my wife as an example, she spent a lot of time on the oncology ward the last year with her leukemia. She's deliberately looked at everybody that walked into her room as a chance to build joy. So first thing to do is smile, to thank the custodian person that you're glad they're there to do the floor, and whatever else. And they're quite unexpecting to have anybody be glad that they're there, and so they look at you like, huh? And then they smile, and this joy starts building. And it wasn't long before the nurses began to say to her, you just don't have enough needs, because we're looking for reasons to be here in your room. Now, why were they looking for reasons? Because she's looking for every chance to build a little joy with anybody who wanders by, by looking in their eyes, making contact, saying something appreciative, getting that little smile back, and pretty soon it's like, oh, yeah, this was a good moment in the middle of not such a great day.
What I love about that is it's easy to think of, well, you're in the hospital, you have something pretty serious, you're not going to be able to do anything that's going to make a difference in anybody's life. And your example is one of your wife making a difference that then reflects back to her, right? So I love that. We're getting other questions, and they're very interesting here. Since you mentioned smiling, which, by the way, it struck me as in mask wearing, this was one of the greatest losses, that you couldn't smile, but you could see smiling in eyes. So this is actually a question. We have a question. Talk about the importance of eye contact. I mean, mostly we'll, Lord willing, not be masked, but even so, how does eye contact matter?
Yeah, well, if you get a little infant and they can look at anything in the room, they will prefer to look at a human face. And if they can look at anything on the human face, they will look at the left side of the human face, which is the side that carries the genuine joy. The right side of your face carries the expression you want people to think you have. So your real emotions go on the left side of your face. And if they can look at any part of the face, they will look at the eye. The eye is about 200 muscles that convey joy. Now there's a smile for the camera, and then there's a genuine joy smile that comes out of your eyes. And so actually eye contact is the most determinative of all the nonverbal communications of real joy. Most people can give you a smile for the family, smile for the camera, and we can immediately tell that from a real joy smile. Only about 2% of people can actually fake a joy smile, which involves the eyes. And actually, it's questionable whether the 2% are faking it or they do it the way I just did by remembering a genuine joy experience. And then you're actually showing them that I'm remembering joy right now rather than totally faking it. But you can do that intentionally. So eye contact, very, very, very important. Also extremely regulated. The rules, this is sort of one of those nice academic moments. The rules in almost every culture around joy are more strict than those around sexuality. There's more taboos about who you can look at and who you can smile at and who you're allowed to have eye contact with than there are sexual taboos. So cultures regulate very much who you can look at. So and who you can smile. So I know when I'm in the airport and I go into the men's room and the bathroom, I should not look and smile at whoever's next to me in the next stall over. That just wouldn't be well received. And little girls are very early taught, who they can look at and smile. These are highly regulated functions because they're so powerful.
That's
so
fascinating.
We have to go back and say what's allowed and how do we as Christians create a culture where it's safe from predators to do more smiling. And we're not doing very well at that. But the people who would be able to do something are the third of life people. If anybody can, become joy agents at large that can smile at people, this is a brand new power you wouldn't be allowed to do if you were in your 20s. But you can start to learn about now.
That is fascinating, and it I think very encouraging. See, I got an interesting question I thought I'd give to you. Doesn't singing and music help create joy?
Well, the answer is it helps create a group identity. So you're in a context in which it's okay to look at the other people and go, hey, we're in this together, so I'm glad to be here with you. But the singing and music actually can make you very sad. You can do sad songs, you can do all kinds of things. It's a open door for relationship. But now the question in the relationship is, do we go from we're all in the same mood to we're going to interact with each other? So it's not the direct builder of joy, but it builds the environment in which we can share all kinds of things with other people if we would take the next step.
That's interesting. And then, following along in terms of what you said earlier, in a worship context, if you're singing to the Lord, there's a relational connection there that could be very much of a joy encourager, I would imagine.
Well, here's most of us have lived through the worship wars and stuff like that. The churches tended to rotate around to where sometimes we sing theology, sometimes we sing the Psalms, but you can't sing theology, and sometimes we sing to the Lord, and sometimes we sing to each other. So I actually grew up in a church environment where some of the songs were sung from one person to another. So, brother, let me be your servant. Let me be like Christ to you. you know, at times when people left, we would sing to them. And when new people joined, we would sing to them. So there's actually a time in the church where it wasn't just singing to God, but it was actually singing to other people. And when we actually do training events, the most powerful moments for most people are when we actually are singing to each other spiritual songs. It says, Paul says, to correct one another through songs and spiritual psalms. And we're actually singing to each other, like, you know, I will help you love your enemies. And to sing that to somebody right eye to eye has an impact that very few other things do. But at the moment, we went from singing theology about God to singing to God. But I think we need to include more of the singing to one another. And you want to find people get uncomfortable in a hurry, just suggest that you should sing something to someone else. And of all the training things we do, that just alarms people more than anything else. Like,
Yeah,
you know.
I think I could feel that alarm.
Yeah.
But it's that's so interesting. Along these lines, we've got a question here that says, the practices are important to growing our capacity to feel joy. I have found that by following a daily meditative practice, one of the beautiful benefits is an expansiveness that brings awareness to joy and beauty each day. What are some meditative practices you have found or witnessed as life supporting?
Well, anything that builds gratitude, or actually noticing where we are and where God is at the moment. So there's the things that still and quiet my soul. Those practices are very, very good. But you know, it's interesting. There's a good part of people who are sympathetic responders. Parasympathetic responders tend to notice things more when they quiet. Sympathetic responders tend to notice things more when they're active. So they've got to be out walking in nature and doing something, or they just can't notice God. And so I think the thing that I would like to make room for is some people are going to have to get out and move. And when they're walking and listening to the birds and interacting with nature and moving their bodies, they will be able to build these joyful practices. And if they sit still, it's like they can't do it. Their minds go crazy. And other people, they need that still time. And again, in churches that really do worship well, they alternate between quiet times when the quieting people could connect with God, and the active praise time, listening to praise music and, you know, jumping even, is when they connect with God. So I think the options are much wider than most people find work for just for them. But I say go explore the things that make you joyful. And if it starts with a strawberry and you really like a strawberry and you're going to be thankful for God for that strawberry, that's where your times of appreciation and joy and experiencing God's presence. One of the things I like to tell people is when you're thankful, ask God to bring something to your mind that brings you peace. And then notice what thought came to your mind. So noticing the thoughts that might come from God is another way of spiritual practices. And often you can write that down, but because the thoughts that come into our mind come from mutual mind experiences, we're never sure at the moment, or almost never sure at the moment, whether the thought came from us or from God, because we'd actually be thinking it together. But when we say it out loud, we go, oh, that has more impact than I thought it did. And so
that's great.
I think most of the practices that we've had are ways of making room for, you know, to notice what God is giving us that we can be grateful for.
That's good. Well, we're getting near the end of our time. We've got a bunch of questions, and so I'm going to let me try to get. Oh, this is a good, very practical, and let me give you all the permission to mention anything that you have done. But a question: what one book would you recommend for pursuing this subject? I would say if you have two, that's okay too, and they can be yours or somebody else's. But I know you've done some great writing. So what would you recommend for us on joy and both building and rebuilding joy?
All right. Well, first I'll make a comment for the thirders among us. And that is that whenever possible, I co-write a book with somebody who's younger. Not only does that really give them a chance to do something, it lets them run around and do all the interviews and the speaking and everything like that. They are as joyful and delighted as possible to get drawn into it. And I don't have to do all that book publicity stuff, and I can go on and work on another book. So I get as many people as possible to write things for me. So I've mentored Chris Coursey. He wrote this book here, just came out, The Joy Switch. And this is how to activate joy in your brain and in relationships. So I really would suggest that book. He and Marcus Warner, both of whom I've sort of mentored, wrote this book here, The 4 Joyful Habits to Raising Joy-Filled Kids. Great for your grandkids. They wrote a book for marriages, the 4 Habits for Joy in Marriages, which is kind of cool. We did this one recently, The Rare Leadership, which is how to build joy in the workplace. Again, very short reads. And then this one here, The Other Half of Church, which I did with Michael Hendricks, on how to build joy in your churches. So part of this is there's a lot of resources coming out, and I get to contribute to them, which is part of being the third of life. You get to build up these younger leaders and let them finish the book and run around and do all the work. They got the energy for that, and I move on and encourage someone else. So I'd also mention that we have a conference coming up for leaders in August, where we're going to be working on basically how do you get out of the sort of the fear half of the brain and into the joy half of the brain. So be a part of this,
that's great.
Creative community, but you don't have to do all the work.
Love that. And I need to say you were so well prepared for that question. I need to say, I know who asked it. It wasn't a plant. That was a real question. You're just ready to go. And by the way, we will, to everyone here on this, in this call, we will send out links so that if you didn't catch all of that, you can get that. And so those resources will be available. Here's an interesting, how do you distinguish between joy and happiness? How do you think about that?
Oh yeah, it's actually quite easy. Happiness doesn't amplify. So you think about something makes you happy, you just stay as happy as you were. Joy actually builds the more you think about it, and it usually involves another person's reactions. So the inertness of happiness, I can be happy with a cookie, but it just doesn't build. But when I look at my grandchild, or even a dog that wags its tail back at me, there's this interactive energy building part to happiness that the more we lean into it, the more the stronger it gets, until our brain reaches a point where we go, oh, give me a break here. Like my grandkids, it's like we build this joy, and it's like, okay, let me sit down and rest. Happiness doesn't do that. I keep eating one more cookie to try to stay happy, and I can eat the whole bag and I'll just end up with stomachache. But with joy, it's like, now I need to rest a little bit here. There's natural joy rest cycle that, it's active, it's vibrant. If you put that test, you'll almost always be able to figure out what's real joy and what's real happiness. I have nothing against happiness, by the way. It just doesn't exercise my brain.
So interesting. I like that. We've had a comment. Somebody mentioned that in a recent study, relationships were highly correlated with health and longevity for people in the third. What you're talking about, I mean, it certainly would be a facet of that, but the importance of relationships for the experience of joy.
Yeah, you notice probably that there's toxic relationships. The more you're around them, the more fear permeates the environment. They're not so good. The relationships that are glad to be together, those are the ones that are really good. They're good for reducing dementia, Alzheimer's, almost coronary disease, stress, everything else that you're kind of wanting to get away from. A joyful relationship, which, by the way, includes the people who let you rest when you need to. some people are joy bunnies, but they won't let you rest. It's like, I can't wait till I get a break. So joy and rest, those are the best relationships to foster. And younger people need us to help them build those as well.
Oh, that's so good. Well, Jim, we're getting right near the end of our time. Is there any sort of concluding comment that you would like to make? Any final words of wisdom for folks?
Yeah, I think there's a way in which life sort of makes us jaded. We've had enough disappointments along the way that, our brain's defenses get in the way and go, well, I'm not sure that's going to work. I'm not sure that's going to try it. And it's basically pain we've had in relationships up until now. Our brain remembers those. And so I would say it's worth saying, if I've got those kind of blockages, Lord, will you lead me on a path that'll bring me back to joy and make my legacy one of joy? Teach me how to do that at this level in life. Help me recognize people who would be an example for me in this final third of life to build and rebuild my joy. I think if we open that door once again, even if we haven't been good at it. I remember one particular person who was, I asked him, well, who are you? And he says, I'm a grumpy old man. So I've always been grumpy. I said, well, in eternity, are you going to be grumpy? He said, no. So then grumpy can't be the real you. So even in this third of life, and he was almost 80 when we had this conversation. I remember talking to him. He was in my Sunday school class, and he came in about 2 years later. He discovered that he was actually a source of joy and blessing to others. Said, I'm sorry I won't be able to attend your Sunday school class. They're going to join the youth class. They need somebody to bless them and smile at them. So don't be discouraged if your life hasn't really made you into as joyful as you want to be. The joy center in the brain retains fetal biochemistry across the lifespan. It's always capable of growth. So all we need to do is practice that, and it will grow.
Great. Well, that's a great conclusion. Jim, thank you so much for this conversation. Thanks for the work you're doing and the resources that are available and experiences that folk can check out by way of your website and the links we will send out. This has just been really interesting and has given us some new ways to think about not only what joy is and how we can experience it, but how we can be carriers and promoters of joy, especially as we're in the third, which I love. That's great. I want to mention to folk who are here, we do webinars like this periodically throughout the year. Our next one is actually in a month, June 25th at 9 a.m. We're going to be looking at retirement reformation, abundant fruitfulness in the third of life with Bruce Brynsma. So we're really drawing from Colorado folk these days. We're getting a lot of wisdom from the state of Colorado. Anyway, that's coming up. We'll let you know about that. Jim, thank you again. Thanks to everyone who has been on this. I'm sorry for those of you, your questions I couldn't get to, but we just ran out of time, but good questions. And thank you. Look forward to seeing many of you again. And Jim, again, you've given us a great gift today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, and thank all the participants for being here. I hope we're going to be a joyful invasion into our culture.
Amen.